Now, a new report by Open Secrets has found that some private corporations are lining up to profit from the proposed energy transition. Now, this report is part of an investigation into South Africa's energy sector and climate crisis. Michael Marchant is the head of investigations at Open Secrets and joins us now. Very good afternoon to you, Michael. Thank you for your time. Your report essentially shines the light on private interests who want to profit from South Africa's current energy crisis and, of course, the proposed energy transition. What stands out as you try and get to the bottom of this chain of events?
Afternoon, Mpho, and thank you very much for speaking to me this afternoon. As you've said, our focus is on the private actors, and I think what we're trying to shine a light on and bring focus onto at this point is that, as people know, the energy space and the proposed transition is a highly contested space in South Africa. And one of the reasons for that is that the state is trying to address this multifaceted crisis of the fact that we don't have electricity, there's sluggish growth, we are increasingly the victims of climate change and environmental degradation. And so there's this contestation about how to try and address these things at the same time. And yet we look at it predominantly often through the lens of Eskom and the failure of Eskom, the corruption there, but also its failure in general to deliver electricity. What we're trying to show is that at every single one of those stages, there are private sector actors that are already profiting from the crisis, the energy crisis and elsewhere, and are positioning themselves to make a great deal of money from whichever direction our energy transition goes. And what the report makes very clear is that there's no surety or clarity right now about what that's going to look like in the immediate short term.
As we try and make sense of the corporate actors involved, how do we now begin to understand what energy profiteers are?
So we've broadly defined energy profiteers as those corporations in the private sector who seek to make a great deal of money from the energy sector more broadly. We know, obviously, the private sector corporations are set up to make a profit, but I think what comes through very strongly in the report, and this is not just a South African experience, but it's a global experience, is that there's a great deal of profiteering that is able to take place, particularly within the fossil fuel sector. And our argument, and this is an argument that's been echoed by a range of other civil society organizations and activists across the country, is that our government, particularly this new and very strong push into new oil and gas, both offshore and onshore, is because it creates so much opportunity, not just for corruption, but profit-taking at a range of different stages. And I think it's a massive risk, I think, both from an energy perspective, a climate perspective, and a justice perspective.
And in trying to get a sense of how this imbalance in power over the energy sector will impact a just energy transition, I mean, what are your findings pointing to, especially as we've seen ministers and officials expressing concern that the country is being pushed to close down its coal-fired plants and essentially jeopardizing jobs and the energy sector?
Mpho, I think that this is kind of the central tension that you raise and that we try and discuss in the report. And it is this notion that South Africa is looking at how to transition its energy sources while simultaneously addressing its contribution to the climate crisis that South Africa itself is a victim of, but also addressing these multiple crises of unemployment, poverty, lack of development, and lack of energy availability in South Africa. I think what we have to be so cautious of is that in many ways those crises are being weaponized by people in government and the private sector to point towards any criticism of particularly the fossil fuel sector, our existing coal-powered plants, but also new coal mines, oil and gas plants, and saying any resistance to that is somehow going to damage jobs, but it also doesn't pay attention to the interests of the country. I think what our report and what the research increasingly is showing is that it's in fact the opposite. It's that this push into new oil and gas not only risks entrenching a status quo that's always been based upon exploitative labor practices and environmental degradation, but also that increasingly there's not a very good economic case for the long term for investing in those projects, and that we're going to leave the country stuck with projects that don't work in the longer term. And if that starts to displace our efforts to adopt renewable energy, there's a huge risk.
Yeah.
Having said that, Paul, what our report also points towards is this concern that what will that transition to renewable energy look like? Is that just going to be monopolized by a new set of corporate actors? I think that indeed is a risk. And so this need to engage in communities, including labor, including those people currently working for coal-fired power plants, is absolutely vital.
As you and I speak, I'm looking at the Daily Investor, a Bloomberg report here, which says that Germany is expected to sign an agreement to lend South Africa 9.9 billion rand to help it transition away from the use of coal-fired electricity. I mean, how should that be interpreted as you speak about corporate actors being involved in energy profiteers? How much of a boost will this cash injection be when we take a look at the current atmosphere that you're tackling in your report?
I think that we have to be cautious with how we view these funds, particularly coming from the global north, because we have to look at two sides of the coin. The one is that historically and on a contemporary basis, powerful countries in the global north have historically contributed the most to emissions. They and their corporations have done the most damage to the planet, and have engaged in highly extractive practices. It's precisely because of that those companies should be providing finances to countries like South Africa and a range of others to aid them in a transition that is now absolutely essential given the precipitous nature of the climate and the social crisis. What I think we have to be cautious on, any way that money is coming in, we have to be incredibly careful about what the terms of those are, that they're not extractive and they're not punitive on South Africa. That's absolutely vital. And then on the other side of it, I think it's whether South Africa is engaging in a coherent enough effort to ensure that when that money comes in and the projects are implemented in South Africa, that those projects are benefiting local people and local companies. And increasingly, that is not the case. There are very often companies headquartered in Europe and elsewhere that are benefiting from the renewables boom here. And that would be a massive missed opportunity, and it would undermine what many people have spoken about when they talk about justice in an energy transition.
Who stands to be disadvantaged here, as we try and piece all of this information together?
So I think, as with historically in South Africa, it is poor and vulnerable communities that are going to be hardest hit on all levels here. If we look at this, if we fail to transition and we double down on fossil fuels and we fail to address our own environmental and contribution to the climate crisis, we've already seen that it is vulnerable communities who are hardest hit by extreme weather events, the flooding in KwaZulu-Natal, all those things that we know are going to get worse. That's the one side of the story. On the other, if we fail to make this transition in a just manner and we just entrench the power, and I mean that in terms of the contribution to power, but also the control and ownership of our energy sector, if that continues to be really condensed and held in a narrow group of private hands, we risk seeing high energy costs that is exclusionary, that harms the poor in South Africa, and that is not sufficiently inclusive to building jobs and transitioning to social ownership of energy sources. Yeah. And so, whichever kind of lens you look at this from, you realize that the risk again is for the poor in the country.
So what are some of the recommendations that you're putting forward?
So there's a range of recommendations in the report, and to try and deal with them kind of as concisely as possible. The one is that we need to broaden the conversation, but beyond the corporations that have always dominated. I think what we see in South Africa, around the world, is that fossil fuel and energy companies are spending a great deal of money to muddy the waters about the reality of energy and the climate crisis. They want to slow down reform, slow down laws that would hold them accountable for their actions. And so, broadening policy discussions and all engagements to include people who are affected, both communities, organized labor, that's absolutely vital. The other is transparency. We need much more information in the public domain about Eskom, PetroSA, the DMRE, and the contracts that it has with those private actors to understand where there are corruption risks. And finally, I think, as we often call for in Open Secrets, is for accountability. And, we have yet to really see proper accountability for corruption and state capture when it came to Eskom. Long-running allegations of corruption at places like Petro SA that embed these types of relationships between the public and the private sector. And so, yes, I think broadly grouped, it's about transparency, it's about accountability, and it's about us as civil society and the public always following the money to work out who's benefiting here.
Very well. Thank you so much for that. Let's leave it there for now. Michael Marchant, Head of Investigations at Open Secret.